Hello everyone, this is the Finnish Phenom, and I'm here to talk about Civil War. No, not that kind, the Marvel Civil War. This crossover event was part of their lengthy line of such story arcs that spanned their titles, and it featured the majority of their roster of heroes, the events taking place essentially affecting everyone who dons a cape and a cowl or whatnot. From what I've come across, a lot of people have been very critical of this storyline, and many have outright condemned it. And trust me, I'm not trying to say it's without its flaws. I felt it had plenty, and I'll get to that. But I certainly don't think it deserves to go without any praise. As a brief reminder of what the story is all about, Civil War deals with what happens after the bill for a Superhuman Registration Act passes, and becomes mandatory for anyone in the United States who has superhuman powers or does the whole mass vigilante thing to register their identity and to get formal training so they can be deputized to officially serve law and order. This all essentially begins when members of the New Warriors mess up arresting a bunch of villains while filming a reality show about it, and the villain known as Nitro ends up using his powers and blowing up several blocks worth of the city of Stanford, including an elementary school, which results in the deaths of several hundred people, including 60 children. The political pressure boils over to do something about the accountability of superheroes and safety of the people, and thus the Superhuman Registration Act is pushed through, and anyone who doesn't want to reveal their identity or submit to the government telling them how to be a hero is suddenly a criminal. The setup and dilemma presented here are really solidly crafted in my opinion. It's a somewhat on-the-nose take on the balancing of liberties and security, a hot topic in American politics for many years, and a topic of such potential depth could have been the basis for a story that could have redefined the potential of comics as a medium. Taking real issues that real people in the real world have to deal with and making comic book heroes live them out is sort of Marvel's forte, and I was expecting great things from this. Unfortunately, when all was said and done, I was left feeling the whole thing fell a little bit short of what it could have been. Don't get me wrong, like I said before, I don't consider Civil War to be bad, just not as good as it had the potential to be. Let's start with looking at the storyline. I think the build-up to passing the bill is solid. I could absolutely believe a tragic event of this magnitude, especially since it involved the deaths of children, to raise a major hullabaloo with people coming out demanding that someone be held responsible and that something, anything, be done to stop anything like it from ever happening again. This is a pretty obvious analog corresponding with 9/11, and the storyline as a whole comes down to a critique of the way its aftermath was handled, with the heroes refusing to register being considered unregistered combatants and having them get locked up indefinitely at the discretion of the authorities until they're either processed onwards for incarceration at their captors' leisure or they give in and cooperate. It's pretty apparent what they're going for is the anti-registration movement members being treated like it's pretty much now legal to treat those accused of terrorism. And again, this has a lot of potential for some really great storytelling by making the reader's experience with the heroes, and it's probably the best executed aspect of the story. It's many of the other parts where I personally felt the story faltered. This kind of story has huge potential, and I felt the moral dilemmas the heroes face could be really something special. The question of whether the word of the law or doing what's right by one's moral compass is the right path to follow is a theme the superhero genre has dealt with for ages, many masked heroes acting outside the law as vigilantes, essentially breaking the law in order to make sure that justice is served. How the world around them reacts to this is varied from hero to hero and even situation to situation. Spider-Man is a prime example, being grudgingly accepted by the police at one time, hailed as a welcome help another, and being told to freeze and put his hands over his head the next, all depending on how his public image is doing at any given time. So exploring this aspect of superheroism could have been really interesting, as the Registration Act would now have forced the heroes to choose between their moral stances on obeying the law and obeying what their heart tells them is right. And if this distinction had been treated with sufficient ambiguity, it could have been something special. But this is one place where I felt the story really falter. Almost immediately they started painting the pro-registration side as the bad guys, having them raid people's homes to arrest them, masked lackeys in black in tow, guns blazing on sight at the slightest hint of resistance, dragging screaming children from the arms of their mothers, attacking former friends with barely a hint of hesitation, and using near-lethal force in their task of enforcing this new law. Rarely did it seem that any valid-sounding argument was made to defend their actions, save for it being a better alternative than whatever the future would have held based on Tony Stark's calculations, which really come across as a scientific equivalent of looking into a crystal ball. If blind faith in his inability to be wrong isn't there, I don't see the reader buying what he is selling. So, yeah, basically the pro-registration heroes are now the freaking Gestapo. There's no ambiguity here. They are the bad guys. They are doing heinous things to other heroes for taking a moral stance, refusing to endanger their families and loved ones and all that, imprisoning them in the inhumane conditions of the negative zone, hiring villains, known murderers, to help hunt down people they had fought alongside to save the world. I can't help but feel this was a major failing. I get that the writers wanted to say that the direction of sacrificing rights for safety is in their opinion the wrong choice to make, but I think it would have made for a much better story if they'd given the readers a bit more credit and let us make up our own minds rather than being spoon-fed their opinion by making these heroes do worse things than some villains would be willing to. Now, if you force yourself to look at it from a logical point of view, one ongoing theme in the story being one of logic versus emotion, you can see why some parts of the law make perfect sense and could even improve the way heroes would function. So a registered hero would have to go through training to make sure they know how to wield their powers and to learn proper procedure for dealing with suspects. Since they would be deputized by the government, I don't see why they should be above having to be trained for the task just like officers of the law are. Better understanding of dealing with situations means less risk of something going wrong. This is a beneficial thing. You need a license to drive a car or carry a gun, so seeing as many superpowers are far more dangerous, I don't see why having to get a license for using them would be unfair either. It just makes sense. As for having to register one's identity, well, there's a simple reason for that as well. Accountability. Again, taking the car example, the license plate isn't just there to hinder thievery by helping verify ownership, but also for identification. Say if a car backs into yours but then just drives off. You get the license down, and they can be held accountable and made to compensate you for the damages. Now, if some masked dude smashed your windshield and ran off, just how would you hope to get his insurance to cover it if you don't even know who it actually was under the mask? With every hero's identity registered, you could be held accountable for your actions, you could be served to appear in court, all the stuff any person would have to do to answer for their actions. But then the way the whole thing is enforced just strips it of any reason for a reader to sympathize with the lawmakers and their line of thought. Law bad, freedom good. There's no balance in the matter. I also felt the individual heroes' struggles with their stance were also very lopsided, with various pro-registration heroes seeing how heartless they'd have to be to hunt down their friends and deciding against following the law, but the anti-registration heroes seemingly never wavering in their belief that morally they did the right thing, at best wondering if taking the stance they did was the right thing to do for their families, but never when it comes to personal morals. So that's how I felt the story fell short of its potential, but the other angle with this event is the possibilities it presents for heroes battling other heroes. A fairly common occurrence in comics, but rarely with so much at stake or at such scale. For anyone who enjoys seeing the good guys go head-to-head and beat the tar out of each other, this might have seemed like the thing to grab. But even there I felt that as a whole it somewhat faltered. True, there were good bits of action thrown in there with smaller skirmishes, but I think an event this size could have used a few more good ones, and I rarely felt that on the whole the action was really satisfying. The two big battles, which were basically the central pieces of the whole thing, were a big mess for the most part. While they felt very grandiose, they were somewhat lacking in getting down to the nitty-gritty, more about the spectacle than individuals pitting their powers and skills against one another. It was hard to tell if either side was gaining an advantage, or how a given individual was doing, save for the central conflict of Captain America and Iron Man. So yeah, I definitely see flaws in the execution when they try tackling massively big real-world issues using masked superheroes, but I still don't see the event as a failure. It actually had gravitas and more or less lasting effects that spilled into the next big stories. Though certain parts have since been forced back to status quo, one more day, it was nonetheless an impactful event that I would recommend to any comic book fan that might have somehow missed it, if only for the sake of the spectacle and giving some food for thought on the themes despite the imperfect way they were addressed. I hope you enjoyed this little opinion piece and leave some feedback. Until we meet again, good journey.